Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome to another edition of After Hours. This Sunday, we kicked off our series that we're calling A Father's Farewell. We're looking at the letter of 2 Timothy. And so I wanted to take just a few minutes to give a little background on who Timothy is. Most people know about Paul and kind of his biography. I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a biography of Timothy, Paul's spiritual son and companion. When we look in the New Testament, there's actually a fair amount of data regarding Timothy. In Acts chapter 16, we meet Timothy for the first time. We're told that he was a disciple in Lystra. Paul is off on his second missionary journey. He had already been out with Barnabas before, but actually at the end of Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas have a disagreement and they kind of split. And Paul goes into the area and he begins to hear about this young disciple named Timothy there in Lystra. And we're told in Acts 16 that Timothy's mom was a believing Jewess. She was a Jew, but his dad was a Greek. And it seems that the dad is an unbelieving Greek because Timothy is not circumcised, we come to learn. And so but that's a little bit of the background that's given there. And we're told that the people there had already noticed something about Timothy. We're told that they speak well of him at Lystra and Iconium and the whole area. They're saying, wow, God seems to really be at work in this young man, Timothy's life. And so Paul wants Timothy to join his apostolic team as he's building it. And they're going to be going off and doing missions. And we're told at that moment, this is why I think his dad is probably an unbelieving Greek, non-Jew is what's really meant by Greek, is because Paul circumcises Timothy. Timothy's a grown young man at the time, but Paul said it's going to be a stumbling block. It might create problems with other Jews as we go out on the mission. So he went ahead and circumcised Timothy right then so that Timothy could join the team. Now, Timothy, then we read throughout the book of Acts and other places in the New Testament, we can piece together how he worked as part of Paul's apostolic team. He's with the team there starting in Acts 16, which is when the team first goes into Europe. Instead of going into Asia, they head over towards Europe. So he's part of the planting of the church in Philippi, where Paul and Silas, you remember, are arrested and there's the whole earthquake and everything else. And Timothy is brand new on the team. So right from the beginning, he's seeing, wow, traveling around with this Paul, you can end up in jail. There can end up being all kinds of problems. He's then part of planting the church in Thessalonica and Berea. This is in Acts chapter 17. He's seeing more persecution go on as Paul has to flee out of Thessalonica because many of the unbelievers there in that area are hounding him, and they follow Paul down to Berea and other places. And so Timothy is there and he's watching and observing all this. And then in Acts 18, he's actually with Paul as Paul goes to plant the church at Corinth. And so Timothy is part of this whole apostolic mission. And so it's not surprising that we see Timothy listed with Paul in the salutations in the beginning and kind of the from in the letter to 2 Corinthians, to the Philippians, to the Colossians, to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and even to Philemon. All of these different places, Timothy is listed at the front of the letter because these people are all familiar with Timothy because he was part of the founding of the church throughout that entire region there in Europe as the church is being founded there. But not only is Timothy with Paul when he's doing that and just kind of, like a background helper, Timothy is often either left by Paul in a particular city to continue work, or he is sent by Paul as an emissary. So in Acts 17, verse 14, we read that Timothy is left at Berea with Silas. And this actually kind of happens often, that Paul has to move and go on, but Timothy is left and stays behind. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, Paul is writing to the Thessalonian church because they had to leave in a hurry because of all the persecution going on, and he's worried about how the church is done. And so when he needs to find out, he can't go back himself because he's kind of, a highly wanted man. So he sends Timothy back to see how the church fared. So notice, first off, it can be very dicey for Timothy to go back, but Paul trusts Timothy to go to this city where they'd only been able to spend the smallest amount of time and planted it there to see how the church has stood up under the persecution. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, which I quoted this morning, Paul refers to Timothy as his true spiritual son and says he's sending him back to Corinth because there's a problem in Corinth, and he's sending Timothy back there to try and help deal with the problems. We know that Timothy struggled, and Paul had to send Titus later to try and help out there with the problems in Corinth. But he did this regularly. In Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 19, Paul holds Timothy up as a great example of the Christian faith, and he says, I'm planning on sending Timothy back to you all in Philippi as Paul is in jail. So we read all of these times. And then 1 and 2 Timothy, the letters that bear Timothy's name, are actually letters where Paul is telling us that Timothy has been left in Ephesus, and we know from later church history that Timothy was in fact around Ephesus, and he was fighting heresies that were growing up, problems that were happening in the church. He was helping to establish elders and leaders there in the church in Ephesus. So Timothy not only was part of Paul's team, he was such a key part that Paul felt comfortable he could leave Timothy to complete work. He could send Timothy back to try and deal with problems, or he could send Timothy in to strengthen churches. He was a valued, trusted co-worker and spiritual son. And I've kind of given this whole thing to say, we can see why Paul wanted Timothy at his side in his final days. This is a true spiritual son. And by way of postscript, there's one other interesting reference to a Timothy. We don't know for certain that it is the same Timothy, but I think it probably is. And that's at the end of the letter to the Hebrews. In Hebrews 13, verse 23, we read that Timothy was released from jail, and he was, that this was of note as was being written to Rome. I have said before, I don't believe that Hebrews was written by Paul. There's a lot of reasons to not think it was written by Paul. But it means that Timothy was so widely known in the church that the author to Hebrews was aware of who Timothy was, and he assumed that the church in Rome, to whom the letter of Hebrews was written, would be aware of Timothy, and that they would be glad to hear that Timothy had actually been released from prison. Church tradition tells us that Timothy was later martyred for the faith, actually, as he was going out and confronting idolatry and heresy, that he was actually martyred. We don't know that for certain, but it is an old tradition in the church. So all of this shows us that Paul is right to call Timothy a true spiritual son, a genuine son, one who had the faith living within him. Timothy was a great friend and follower of Paul, an important part of seeing the church planted and thriving in the New Testament, and in many ways a great example for you and I. So I hope this helps you a little bit to think through as we're reading through and studying this letter in the weeks to come. Hope it encourages you and as you go through this week, and I look forward to all of us gathering together on Sunday as we come together to worship our great God.